Never said a word to me. Week goes by, they go to Pocono. Right?
Did he say a word to you?
No.
He was not supposed to be the one who reached him first. Of the cars tangled together on the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500, Ken Schrader's yellow number 36 came to rest closest to the wrecked black number 3. He climbed out of his own car uninjured, and instead of checking on himself, he walked straight toward Dale Earnhardt's Chevrolet. For 25 years, that walk across the grass in Turn 4 has been one of the most replayed, least explained moments in American sports. Schrader gave interviews. He sat for documentaries. He let people assume whatever they wanted about what he saw through that window. He never confirmed it, and he never denied it either. He just moved the conversation somewhere else every single time. Now, in his early 70s, still racing on dirt tracks most weekends, still doing a podcast with his old friend Kenny Wallace, Schrader has finally started talking at length about that day. Not because a network paid him to. Not because a documentary crew wore him down. He talked because a quarter century had passed, because NASCAR marked the anniversary with retrospectives and tribute segments, and because, in his own understated way, he decided the story deserved more than silence. What he offered was not the graphic detail fans spent 2 decades speculating about. It was something more interesting. The full shape of a friendship that started with 2 men racing each other to finish a shop roof and ended with one of them standing at a window he never talks about, deciding on the spot what his friend's family needed to hear first. To understand what happened at that window, you have to understand what kind of day it had been up to that point. Schrader was not some anonymous background figure who happened to end up near the wreck. He had run well the entire afternoon, leading 7 laps and spending long stretches of the race inside the top 5. All day, he had been drafting close to Earnhardt's black Chevrolet, the 2 of them working together the way drivers who trust each other on a superspeedway often do. Up front, the race had already been decided. Michael Waltrip and Dale Earnhardt Jr. had pulled away from the field, running 1-2 in cars, both owned by Dale Earnhardt himself, through his team, Dale Earnhardt Incorporated. Waltrip had gone winless in more than 460 career starts. This was finally going to be his day, and it looked like a storybook finish for the whole Earnhardt operation. The boss's own cars sweeping the biggest race in the sport, with the boss himself running interference a few car lengths back. Behind that lead pair, a tight group had formed. Schrader, Earnhardt, Sterling Marlin, and Rusty Wallace, fighting for a finishing position that would not change who won the race, but would matter to every driver in it. Coming off the backstretch and into Turn 3, Schrader moved to the outside. He and the others had raced beside Earnhardt often enough to know that trying to pass him underneath rarely worked. Going high was the sensible move, the one experience had taught them. It also happened to put Schrader in exactly the wrong place when everything went wrong a few seconds later. Earnhardt's car made contact with Marlin's low on the track. His black Chevrolet shot up the banking and into the outside wall at roughly 180 miles an hour. Schrader, running the high line at that exact moment, could not get out of the way in time. His car struck Earnhardt's as both slammed into the concrete barrier. From the broadcast booth, it did not look like the worst crash of the day. NASCAR had seen far more violent, more visually dramatic wrecks over the years, and for a few seconds the cameras stayed on victory lane instead of Turn 4, because nothing about the wreck screamed catastrophe the way a rolling, disintegrating car normally would. Schrader climbed out of his own wreck first. He was not hurt. Instead of walking away, he went straight to the number 3 car, still smoking, still settling against the wall. According to Schrader's own account, given 25 years later, he did not need long at that window to understand what he was looking at. He has said plainly that he knew what the outcome was going to be almost as soon as he got there. He did not try to pull Earnhardt from the car. He turned and signaled urgently for the medical crew, a gesture that told anyone watching closely far more than any statement could have. That instinct to know immediately what a silent cockpit at that speed usually meant came from experience. By 2001, Schrader had already spent close to 2 decades racing in NASCAR's top series. He was one of the most durable, well-liked drivers in the garage, a man who had lined up against Earnhardt more times than either of them could probably count. He was not a stranger reacting to a stranger's crash. He understood, before any doctor arrived, exactly what he was looking at. While rescue workers surrounded car number 3, the broadcast stayed locked on victory lane, where Waltrip was celebrating the biggest win of his career, and Earnhardt Jr. had just finished second, both of them still unaware that the afternoon was about to turn. Schrader did not head toward the interview area. He went looking for one specific person. He found Waltrip mid-celebration and pulled him aside, away from the cameras. He has since described exactly what he told his friend, that it was not his place to announce anything publicly, but that he was not going to let Waltrip get blindsided by the news later. He wanted Mikey to hear it from him first, quietly, rather than from a stranger or a headline. Waltrip finished his winner's interview minutes later, without knowing how quickly the day was about to change. Officials pulled him away before reporters could ask why. By the time the sun went down over the speedway, doctors at the infield care center had worked for the better part of an hour before the outcome became official. NASCAR President Mike Helton delivered the announcement to the media that evening in a moment that is still replayed in every retrospective. The toughest statement, in his own words, that he had ever had to make. The sport had lost its biggest star. Earnhardt's photograph ran on the cover of Time magazine within days. Newspapers that had never covered auto racing before put the crash on their front pages. Schrader has said the reaction reminded him of the death of Elvis Presley, an entire culture stunned that someone that large could actually be gone. He has also said, with the same plainness he brings to most things, that he had no idea the sport carried that kind of weight with the wider public until he watched the reaction unfold in real time. To understand why Schrader carried that afternoon so privately for so long, it helps to go back to how he and Earnhardt became close in the first place. Schrader arrived in North Carolina in the 1980s chasing a Cup Series career, a driver from Fenton, Missouri, with no connection to the tight-knit racing families that already dominated the sport. He was an outsider by almost every measure that mattered in that world. He and Earnhardt found each other anyway, building race shops within a few miles of each other near Mooresville around the same time, with a friendly, half-serious rivalry over whose building would be finished first. That competitiveness followed them everywhere, on the track and off it. Long before Earnhardt's own shop grew into the sprawling headquarters of Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, the two of them were just neighbors racing each other to finish construction, needling one another about whose crew was faster, whose foundation was poured first. It was the kind of closeness that had nothing to do with trophies. When Schrader was preparing to buy land for his own property, Earnhardt rode along to look at it with him and walked him through how to build a pond on it, drawing on years of country know-how, and promised to supply the fish once it was finished. When the pond was ready and Schrader called to collect, the fish showed up, delivered cash on delivery, a detail Schrader still brings up as proof that even Earnhardt's generosity came with a catch. There were sillier stories, too. At a car show in Detroit, both men fell for the same impractical purchase, an amphicar, a small vehicle built to drive on pavement and float on water. They left the show, got partway to the airport, and turned back around because neither one could let the idea go. Earnhardt put down a cash deposit on the spot. Once the car was delivered, he laid down one condition. Schrader was not to take it into the water without him there to see it. Schrader ignored him almost immediately and launched it alone the first chance he got. Earnhardt was furious for about as long as it took him to move on to the next argument, which was about the money he still owed Schrader for his half of the purchase. These are not the anecdotes people usually associate with Dale Earnhardt, the 7-time champion, the intimidator, the most feared closer in stock car racing. They are the anecdotes of a friendship, small and specific, the kind of detail that only survives between people who genuinely liked each other. Schrader has leaned into telling those stories in recent years, not instead of talking about the crash, but as a way of rounding out who Earnhardt actually was to the people closest to him, beyond the black number 3 and the sunglasses and the reputation. For years, one explanation for Earnhardt's final laps hardened into something close to legend, that he was running defense on the final lap, holding the field back so his son and his top driver could cruise to a 1-2 finish without pressure from behind. It is a clean, sentimental story, and it has been repeated in documentaries and anniversary pieces ever since. It is also not how Schrader describes what he saw develop in those final seconds. By his own account, Waltrip and Earnhardt Jr. did not need protecting that day. Their cars were simply faster, and the finish up front was already decided well before the last lap began. What Schrader has described instead is a driver doing what he always did, racing for every position that was left to race for, right down to the final corner, in a pack that included 3 or 4 other cars, all trying the same thing. Schrader has explained his own decision to go to the outside in plain, unromantic terms. It was not a gamble or a bold move. It was a lesson from years of racing beside Earnhardt, who had made the inside line a losing proposition often enough that nobody in that group wanted to try it again. Going high was simply what experience told them to do. It also happened to be exactly the position that left Schrader with nowhere to go when Earnhardt's car came up the banking toward him a few seconds later. That is a smaller, less mythologized version of the story than the one that circulated for 2 decades. It replaces a noble sacrifice with something more familiar and, in its own way, more honest. A man competing the way he always competed, in the very last corner he ever drove. The weeks that followed the crash reshaped American racing in ways that are still visible today. Investigators examined everything from the construction of the concrete wall itself to the way Earnhardt's seatbelt had failed on impact. A public dispute broke out between the racing team and the belt manufacturer, each side pointing at the other, and the pressure became severe enough that the founder of the safety equipment company stepped down. Later reviews found that Earnhardt had long adjusted his belts for comfort in a way that may have reduced how well they performed in a direct hit, and that he had resisted newer head and neck restraint devices for years, viewing them as a hindrance rather than a protection worth the discomfort. He was far from alone in that view. Trading comfort for feel behind the wheel was common practice at the time, and almost nobody questioned it out loud until it cost the one driver who needed it most. The combination of an aging belt setup and no head restraint turned a crash that looked survivable on television into the moment that finally forced the sport's hand. NASCAR eventually released an extensive investigative report, running past 500 pages, tracing the physics of the crash down to fractions of a second and identifying dozens of contributing factors. Out of that report came sweeping changes within just a few years: energy-absorbing safer barriers installed at every major track, a redesigned safety chassis for the cars themselves, and a head and neck restraint device that quickly became mandatory equipment for every driver in the sport. To NASCAR's credit, no driver has died from injuries sustained in a racing accident in the top national series since. Every one of those changes almost certainly saved lives in the years that followed, drivers walking away from impacts that would have ended careers, or worse, under the old equipment. Schrader watched all of it unfold from the inside, still racing every weekend, still competing against the same field, carrying a memory none of his rivals shared with him. He rarely gets credit in that part of the story, since none of the safety reforms carried his name or came from his advocacy. But he lived through the exact crash that forced the sport's hand, close enough to feel it, and he kept racing through every generation of car that came after it. What makes Schrader's public handling of the crash unusual is not that he stayed quiet about it. Plenty of people who witness tragedy prefer not to discuss it. What makes it unusual is how deliberately he drew the line year after year, interview after interview, between what he was willing to share and what he decided belonged to the Earnhardt family alone. He has spoken in detail about the last lap itself, where he moved on the track, why he chose the outside line, what it felt like to be racing beside a man he had known for 2 decades. He has spoken about walking to the car and about warning Waltrip before anyone else could reach him. He has said clearly that he never thought it was his place to describe to the world what he personally saw in that cockpit, and that the choice to keep that part private was never about protecting himself. It was about protecting a family from having its worst moment reduced to a single graphic detail on a highlight reel. When Dale Earnhardt Jr. brought Schrader on as a guest on his own podcast, years before this recent round of anniversary interviews, Jr. addressed what he called the elephant in the room directly, acknowledging on the air that Schrader was the man who reached his father's car first, and thanking him for the way he had carried that role ever since. It was, by most accounts, an emotional exchange, one that reframed Schrader's silence not as evasion, but as a kind of quiet loyalty that had gone unacknowledged for far too long. Since then, Junior has continued to speak warmly about Schrader in interviews, describing him as something close to family, a presence in his life that outlasted the tragedy that first connected them in the public's mind. Even now, in the interviews tied to the 25th anniversary, Schrader has not described in graphic terms exactly what he saw through that window. Reporters who have sat across from him recently, including some who covered the sport for decades and consider him a personal friend, describe him as clearly uncomfortable revisiting the day, but honest and engaged rather than closed off. That combination, discomfort paired with openness, seems to be exactly where Schrader has decided to leave it. Willing to talk about almost everything else, the friendship, the shop, the amphicar, the last lap decisions, the years of racing that followed, while keeping one specific detail exactly where it has always been,